The passing of Don Shula, the NFL's all-time winningest coach and the architect of the NFL's only perfect season, and the person who put Miami sports on the map more than any other. Around the horn and around the home with Mina and Pablo Torre and Israel Gutierrez. Israel, Miami born and bred. I'll start with you. What does Don Shula mean to the city of Miami and to the Dolphins and the NFL?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that this happens now while this Jordan documentary is happening, because it just seems to put a little bit of perspective on that time. And I think when you think about Don Shula's career down in South Florida, and you realize not only did he come in and win a championship in a way that still hasn't been copied, right, the undefeated season, but he sort of carried the flag for South Florida sports for decades. If you think about if Don Shula wasn't as consistently great of a coach and didn't have these, high-level teams year after year after year, what would the South Florida landscape have looked like after that? It wasn't until 1993 that there was another professional team down here, and yet South Florida was still considered respected. The Dolphins were absolutely relevant, and it was in large part because of one man sort of bridging the gaps between the generations. And even just living until 90 and being around other generations of sports fans down here and parents and grandparents telling the story of Don Shula, even today young kids recognize sort of the measure of respect he commanded down here and what he did for South Florida sports.
Mina, I'll bring you in here, being a football analyst as you are and a historian in some way as well. What does Don Shula mean to the sport of football and to the franchise of the Dolphins?
Well, he is unambiguously one of the greatest coaches in the history of the sport. You'll hear about the undefeated season or the fact that of 33 seasons, he only had 2 losing ones, which is remarkable. But what strikes me most looking back is that he didn't do it only with the Hall of Fame quarterbacks, and he coached 3 of them. In 1981, after Bob Greasy retired, the Dolphins went 11-4-1. Very few people can name the quarterbacks from that year. I saw a stat that blew my mind today. Don Shula coached 68 games where he started a backup quarterback, and he won 49 of them. That is why he is one of the greatest to ever do it.
Incredible. Wow. Yeah, I think it was 5 championship games, Super Bowl or NFL championship game, different quarterbacks in 5 games as well. Pablo Torre, what does Don Shula mean to the NFL?
I mean, he has an unimpeachable coaching resume, as we know. He had an unimpeachable jawline, just one of the great faces, one of the great skulls in sports history. And in a sport that's so hard to isolate greatness in, right? Like everybody's accomplishment statistics are all hinging on other people in a way that many sports, we don't see that. He did this over 3 decades, a Super Bowl in the 60s, a Super Bowl in the 70s, a Super Bowl in the 80s, and he did it playing different styles, really old school, obviously, in Baltimore in the 60s, and all the way to Dan Marino, right, and opening up that offense, modernizing the game for everybody else. So just tremendously and unimpeachably singular in this game.
That's very much a family tree of almost the start of the NFL to the modern NFL. And you brought it up, Pablo. I agree with you 100%. When you think of NFL coach in a couple ways, you think of Vince Lombardi, maybe you think of the look, Mike Ditka or Hank Stram. But for me, it's also Don Shula, the way he dressed, the slick in the hair, and that also brought in a little Miami because he was always perfectly tanned as well. Thanks for your thoughts on the legend Don Shula.